The Last Witch by M. Frappier. Copyright 2011, audio copyright 2023. Frapp Media. For Becky. Chapter 1. The house at 1558 Bellevale Road was a rambling old Victorian. Its once graceful silhouette had been warped out of shape by numerous additions of indeterminate age and time period. The obscure structure sat upon 15 acres of sprawling bog, surrounded by a forest of gnarled and ancient trees. The finishing touch was a backyard filled with lush, colorful gardens that seemed to glow against the muted green leaves of an enormous hedge maze. The house itself was massive and ancient. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the room smelled dusty and stale. There were hundreds of secret passageways and false walls. According to legend, the previous owner had been a thin little man with a large round head. I always imagined his ghoulish form slipping away down the dark secret passages for hushed meetings with mysterious visitors in the night. As a little girl, I wandered the passages and searched for the monsters from the stories. I wanted proof they were real. Everyone in school knew the tales, and I was teased mercilessly. I needed to find something to protect me from their cruel taunts. I was 5 when I moved into the house with my great-grandmother, Valencia Valdala. Valencia was eccentric and strange. She wandered the halls and muttered to herself while her fingers wove invisible pictures in the air. Her body was wiry and strong, though she was 94 the summer of my 16th birthday. She liked to be alone and rarely spoke to me, though when she did, she seemed to like me well enough. Valencia took me in after my parents died in a car crash. I had been visiting her when it happened. I often try to remember them, but the memories are fragmented and infrequent. I remember the shape of my mother's face, but the details are fuzzy and out of focus. My father was nothing more than a scent, a certain aftershave or soap. I smelled it once in a department store when I was 10, and it knocked me down. I came to in the employee lounge where Valencia was hovering over me, anxiously gripping my hand and yelling at the paramedics. The locals think the house is haunted. It stood empty for decades. Many people tried to live there, but no one ever stayed for very long. A doctor lived there for a short time in the 80s. He had a lot of gambling debts and finally went crazy one night and cut up his wife. He kept her body in a giant walk-in freezer that composed one of the uglier additions to the house. It jutted off the western corner like a big metal boil. Her ghost was rumored to haunt the addition and walk the halls every night precisely at 2:14 a.m. I stayed up for days after I heard that tale. I would creep quietly through the shadows and wait by the freezer door, but I never saw her. There were many rooms in the house that Valencia had deemed off-limits, but the freezer wasn't one of them. She just never used it. It was only slightly cooler than the rest of the house and wouldn't actually keep anything frozen. Valencia had filled it floor to ceiling with her stuffed animal collection. She had dogs, cats, monkeys, and jaguars. The largest was a massive grizzly bear with teeth that looked like long, glistening knives. Its claws were longer than my hand and looked razor sharp. I only saw the inside of the freezer once. I had heard the kids at school talking about the doctor and his wife. I ran home and went straight to the freezer. I wanted to see if anything weird would happen. Nothing did. The room just seemed sad, filled with death and left to gather dust. The grizzly was the only thing that frightened me. It haunted my dreams for months. It was alive again and hunting me. Wherever I went, it was always just behind, and I would feel its hot breath on my neck just before waking in a cold sweat. The kids at school kept away from me, as if the house had tainted me with its grisly past. In addition to the rumored haunting, Valencia was deemed a witch, because she went about talking to herself and glaring at anyone who dared to meet her eye. She dressed in dark robes and long flowing skirts, and her hair was a halo of gray frizz. I had once asked her to tone down her eccentric behaviors, but she only looked at me with a rare, beaming smile. "Let 'em talk, dear. It's good for the imagination." I did most of the errands myself to avoid more speculation and walked into town at least once a day. The house was located at the end of a mile-long drive that twisted through the tall pine trees surrounding the house. The driveway joined a dirt road that led into town. At the corner sat the only house within miles of ours, a large brick monstrosity dotted with windows like numerous sleepless eyes. It stood empty until that summer. I had just turned 16, celebrating this milestone birthday with a small store-bought cake that I purchased myself. Valencia serenaded me with her crackly voice, and when I blew out the candles, I made a wish. I had never done that before. My 16th birthday was different. The end of 10th grade was approaching and the summer loomed before me. The other kids still avoided me. My name was something that could only be spoken in hushed tones amidst a tight group of bodies as they huddled together against the lonely outsiders. During that entire school year, only 4 students had even said hello to me. One was Tiffany Brenwick, the bubbly blonde whose smile was like a flame, attracting other students to her like moths. There was almost a choreography to the jostling of bodies as they tried to each position themselves closest to her. She was nice to everyone, and she made a point of saying hello to those of us who could not be accepted into her sphere. I was thinking about Tiffany, who had already been assured a place on the varsity cheerleading squad next year, as I trudged home carrying 2 bags of groceries and my backpack. As I neared our driveway, I noticed a large moving van parked outside the house on the corner. 2 burly men, in Rick's Moving Company t-shirts and dirty jeans, were hefting a sofa, while a tiny, beetle-like woman scuttled back and forth, nervously giving them directions. There was a squeal from inside the house, and a teenage boy raced out the front door carrying his little sister on his shoulders. She flung her arms in the air and screamed with wild joy as he ran across the lawn toward the edge of the forest. The mother paused and shot a frightened look at her children, before smiling and turning back to the 2 Goliaths still grunting under the weight of her floral-printed sofa. The boy swung his sister down to the grass, and she ran to embrace her mother. He looked at me, and I blushed and quickly looked away. I'd grown used to being ignored, and reacted with terror when someone actually looked at me. His eyes were a startling light blue. Keeping my own eyes on the road, I walked a little faster. The bags were heavy. I had planned to stop and rest at the corner before continuing up the drive, and my shoulders were burning. The handles of the bags were cutting into my palms, and my fingers were numb. I heard footsteps. When I looked up, the boy was walking beside me. His smile was a flash of white in his tan, handsome face. He brushed a strand of golden hair from his eyes and reached out to take my bags. "Here, let me take those. They look heavy. My name's Blade." "Blade?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "My old man's idea." He sighed and shook his head. "Long story." We walked along in silence. I knew I needed to say something, but I hadn't spoken with anyone other than Valencia in years. I struggled for words, any words to end the silence, but they wouldn't come. I listened instead to the sound of our footsteps. We were walking in sync, our steps beating out a simple rhythm. He laughed out loud suddenly, and I jumped. The sound was so light and foreign, surrounded by the heaviness of the trees. "You're a quiet one, huh? No problem. I can talk forever. I hope you don't mind." He flashed me another pearly white smile. "I don't mind," I squeaked. "I'm Casey." He was very handsome. His arm accidentally brushed up against mine, and my heart jumped into my throat. He talked without pausing until we reached the house. At the door, he handed me my bags and bowed like someone out of a Jane Austen novel. "Nice to meet you, Casey. I hope we'll see each other again soon." Another flash of smile, and he was off. His shoulders were broad under his gray t-shirt, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. I watched until he rounded the curve in the driveway and disappeared from view. Valencia was watching from the window above. The curtain fell back as I looked up, and I was certain at that moment that I would never see Blade again. He must have seen Valencia's witch-like face hovering over us like impending doom. He would soon meet other kids in town and hear the stories. He would be relieved that he had survived that brief encounter, and I would be forgotten. I went back to my usual summer pursuits. I read, wrote in my journal, and wandered the halls of the house. I made my daily pilgrimage to town to buy things for Valencia. I don't think she needed most of them. She hoped that I would make friends if I kept going into town, as if I could be absorbed into a group just by walking past them every day. She didn't know the anguish it caused me, passing them day after day as they sprawled outside the doors of the grocery store. The boys attempted tricks on their skateboards while the girls watched and giggled together. As I approached, their eyes would skid over me, stop for a brief moment, and then look away. I was forgotten as soon as I passed. My feet could never move fast enough when I was leaving, though approaching always felt slow, like walking underwater. I hadn't seen any of the inhabitants of the brick house since that first day, but there were signs of those who dwelt inside. A bike was left in a heap on the lawn with its pink and silver tassels raised into the air like a flag. There was a skateboard abandoned on the front steps, and bright pansies and marigolds lined the front walk. Once I thought I saw a curtain on the upstairs window fall back into place as I passed, and I imagined Blade watching me through a small gap in the fabric. It made my heart race, and I kept my eyes on the ground and hurried home. After a week, I was sure he was watching me. He had been a moment too slow, and I saw him standing in the second-floor window, the one on the eastern end of the house closest to the forest. His face, in the brief moment before the curtain obscured my view, was troubled. There was a look of sorrow that made me wonder if someone close to him had just died. It was a quick glimpse, and I couldn't be sure what I had actually seen. I had to accept that it was probably my imagination. It was certainly a romantic notion, and I was in the habit of concocting wild tales about people based on the slightest interaction. Being ignored had turned me into a storyteller, and I enjoyed the romantic tales I wove. My head spun out love stories like webs to trap my loneliness. I was always lonely, and had hoped many times for companionship. There had been a few girls, new students who were nice to me at first, but dropped me without hesitation when they heard the stories, or caught a glimpse of Valencia. There was one in particular that haunted me, a girl named Christy. A perky name for a perky girl. Christy squealed everything that she said. She was easily confident and did not fall prey to the insecurities that were common for new students. She was certain that she would be accepted, and I was merely a bump in the road, a required irritation that would soon pass and be forgotten. She screamed in terror when she first saw Valencia. I had made the mistake of mentioning Christy the night before. I naively believed that she and I would become best friends. I imagined us giggling and walking arm in arm down the halls, a united front against the hostilities of high school. I think Valencia was excited for me. In her youth, she was surrounded by friends and adored by all who met her. The house was covered with framed photographs, snapshots of brief moments in her life that captured her happiness, her laughter, and her thorough enjoyment of everyone and everything around her. My lack of popularity devastated her, and it was made worse by the fact that she had already outlived her multitude of friends. She had once had hundreds of them, collected over the years like porcelain figures. The last one passed when I was 10. Valencia was 88 at the time, but acted more like a teenager. But something happened when that last friend passed. She seemed to shrink into a shell of her once boisterous self. She stayed inside the house and hobbled from room to room, muttering to herself. It was monotonous, almost a chant, and was composed of low, guttural sounds that came from deep in her throat. I couldn't understand many of the words, but the few that did reach me were disjointed and disturbing. That was when Valencia turned from eccentric to the kind of strange that people only spoke of in whispers. The kind that made the speaker pause, with a theatrical raising of their eyebrows. She became obsessed with finding me friends, which ended in a few embarrassing and futile playdates. She eventually gave up, too exhausted by her efforts to continue. The woman who had always seemed so vibrant and youthful had grown old in a matter of months. Loneliness ruined her. She didn't have my ability to withstand it. Valencia was waiting for me outside the main entrance of the school that day. It was Christy's second day, and the depth of my unpopularity was becoming clear to her. She was starting to distance herself from me in her polite way. It was a slow process that I would gladly stretch out for as long as possible. Her look of horror when she saw Valencia, who looked more witch-like than usual with a smear of red across her lips, is seared into my mind forever. Humiliation filled me as she turned from me to the haggard crone on the sidewalk and back again. I have never hated Valencia as much as I did at that moment. I wanted to strike her wrinkled, grinning skull, barely covered in that thin layer of frizzled hair. Instead, I ran. I ran all the way to the house, threw myself onto my bed, and cried until Valencia returned home a few hours later. Christy was absorbed into the popular crowd immediately. They helped her through the horrible ordeal of seeing Valencia, and by the next morning she was all smiles and new friendships. She was the last new student I tried to befriend. There had been others. It seemed as if there were always new people moving into Crystal River. But I ignored their hesitant advances, let them flounder for a moment before they moved on to the next kid in line, a huge girl with man-sized hands and round glasses that were too small for her large face. She had permanent sweat stains under her arms and a best friend named Marjorie, which ranked her slightly above me on the popularity ladder. I was thinking about Christy the second time I saw Blade. He was hunched over the flower bed and pulling weeds. I'd seen his mom slaving away over her flowers several times as I walked home. She was a small, fragile-boned woman who wore a large man's shirt and faded black capris when she gardened. She topped them off with gardening gloves and a floppy, wide-brimmed hat. It hid her expression in shadow whenever she raised a timid, gloved hand in greeting as I slouched by with my bags. I would briefly raise my eyes to the eastern second-floor window and glance over her meek greeting before turning back to my flip-flops. Blade turned at the sound of my steps scuffing the dirt. He smiled and wiped his brow, leaving a brown smudge above his eyes that seemed to enhance his good looks rather than mar them. He dropped the pruning shears on the grass and walked toward me. I've replayed that walk in my mind 1,000 times, slowing it down and savoring every second. Blade Connor was my first crush, and it began in that moment. He was athletic, about 6 feet tall, and a year or two older than me. He hopped the fence, took my bags from me, and we continued up the driveway. He flashed me another brilliant smile and winked. "Miss me?" I was too shocked to speak and just barely managed a slight nod. I could feel my face growing hot. He was staring at me with an expression that was oddly detached, as if I was an exhibit in an art museum, and he was trying to understand the depths and complexities hidden beneath the surface. "Man, you are a quiet one. That's cool, though. I like serious girls." We walked on in silence. I didn't know what to say. I wondered if he had somehow missed seeing Valencia the first time he came to the house. That was the only explanation for why he was still speaking to me. But I didn't have to wonder for long, for as we rounded the bend in the driveway, Valencia came into view. My spine stiffened, and I felt an immediate urge to run. Blade placed his hand on my arm. His brilliant smile never wavered as we approached the old crone. Valencia's reaction was even more surprising than Blade's calm countenance. Her face started to stretch up into her usual hideous grin, but it faltered when her eyes landed on him. She hesitated, which was something I had never seen Valencia do. There was not a moment I could remember when she had not spoken her mind in her careless, brash manner. But she seemed to shrivel before Blade, showing all of her 94 years. We stopped to greet her, and she extended a withered hand cautiously. Her voice was weak and husky. I was horrified when Blade bowed and kissed her hand, but his smile never faltered as his lips touched the parched skin. But Valencia gave a yelp and pulled her hand away. She stared at him mutely. My cheeks burned with embarrassment and rage, and I quickly pushed past her and started back to the house. Blade followed. He turned once and looked over his shoulder, and his smile grew larger. I turned. Valencia was where we had left her. She stood staring at the ground, and she was muttering. I wanted to run into the house, lock myself in my room, and never leave again. Then Blade laughed, and my anxiety disappeared. We laughed all the way back to the house, where he stopped and handed me my bags. He smiled at me through several strands of golden hair. "We should hang out sometime, Casey. Daytime's better for me. I'm free any time before 4. I didn't know what to say. No boy had ever wanted to hang out with me. Usually they hurled insults at me while I walked by, pretending to contemplate my shoes. I thought my heart would pound out of my chest, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. Everything got hazy around the edges, and I felt the world slip sideways. Blade caught me as I fell and saved my head from the stone steps. He helped me to sit and sat down beside me. After a few moments, the world stopped spinning, and I felt a little better. I became aware of his arm lightly touching mine, and his minty breath on my cheek. I stood shakily and went to the door. I couldn't look at him. I was absolutely certain that I was the only person in the world who had fainted because a boy asked me out. I went inside and closed the door softly behind me. I pressed my back against the ancient wood and waited for my heartbeat to slow. When I peeked out the window, Blade was already nearing the bend in the driveway. I watched him disappear behind the trees, then went out to collect the groceries I had left on the steps. Chapter 2. I avoided Valencia that night. She returned from her walk a few hours later, and I hid in my room. I waited for her cracked, bellowing voice to call me, anticipating the thrill of ignoring her. But she didn't. She shuffled into the library. I heard the familiar squeak of the door's ancient hinges. And then the house was silent. I went back to my window, which faced west, the direction of the brick house at the end of the drive. I sat and stared at the trees. The emotions I was experiencing were all new and strange. My stomach churned, my hands trembled, and I grinned stupidly as I walked around my room in a daze. I suspected I was in love. I couldn't stop thinking about Blade, and my cheeks grew hot whenever I thought about that afternoon. I couldn't imagine what he was thinking right now. The house hadn't scared him off, and he found Valencia amusing. He would be the first person I had scared away on my own. I felt desperate. He was everything I had always wanted, and he was slipping away. I wanted to go to his house and tell him. I wasn't sure what I would say or what I expected from him. Maybe I wanted the movie moment. Having no friends, I turned to movies and books for companionship, and the thing I wanted most was that moment in the story when against all odds the couple comes together in a passionate embrace, and you know that their love will survive and conquer all obstacles. I imagined Blade throwing open the door, declaring his undying love, and kissing me. Thinking about kissing made me nervous. It seemed like a very awkward thing, and I was afraid that when I finally had my first kiss, I would do something embarrassing and wrong. I went to the television and turned it on. I hoped it would distract me, and for a while it did, but I quickly lost interest in the show and its pre-recorded laughter. I flopped onto my bed and stared at the ceiling high above me. It was a deep blue and painted with intricate silver designs. The work was very fine, and I often marveled at the amount of time it must have taken to create. There were shapes in the designs, animals, women, flowers, and strange faces that gave me chills. I spent hours staring at the ceiling as I tried to fall asleep. The pictures were always there, but they seemed to change and move during different times of the year. The paint never faded, and it looked the way it had when I first came to live with Valencia. There was something magical about it. There were many strange things in the house, odd and ancient pieces of wood, stone faces, and large crystals in various hues and shapes. Valencia had traveled a lot in her youth, and she had brought back thousands of souvenirs over the years. I liked to imagine that she was actually a witch, and behind the doors of the rooms forbidden to me were mystical potions, strange animals, and crystal balls. That night as I stared at the ceiling, the pictures began to shift. It started slowly. I wasn't sure if I had actually seen it at first, but then the lines began to move faster, until they were swirling and writhing and weaving through each other like hungry silver snakes. They slowed and twisted into the shape of a face. Blade's face. Then I felt the room falling in around me, and darkness closed in. I woke up around midnight. I was in bed with the covers drawn tightly over me. My head ached, and my body was slick with sweat. The room was filled with moonlight, and the shadows of the trees stretched out across the walls. My window was open, and a cool breeze made the curtains flutter. A silvery ball of light slipped into the room and hovered above me for a moment before it burst upon the ceiling in a shower of sparks. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stood at the window watching for the first streaks of dawn. The sky turned slowly from an inky blue to a bright gold, and still I stood waiting. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I stood motionless looking out at the trees. The lack of sleep made me delirious, but I felt certain that if I waited, something or someone would soon appear. I heard his footsteps long before I saw him. Near the house, the drive crosses a place where the land slopes steeply away, down a cliff covered in a plush carpet of grass and fallen leaves. Sounds traveled differently there. I could hear the slight scuff of his feet through the dirt before his firm, confident step. I stood frozen in my place of vigil and waited for him. When he rounded the bend, he was looking right at my window, and he smiled when he saw me. Seeing him made the fears of the night vanish, and I smiled boldly. My fear of being rejected was diminishing, and I was thrilled to see him return. Apparently, Blade liked quiet girls who fainted at the mere mention of spending time with him. I didn't move from the window. I didn't run to meet him. I just stood there, watching him approach. His eyes never left my face as he walked, even when he veered suddenly off the drive and across the grass toward my window. He stopped and set a large picnic basket on the ground beside him. I hadn't noticed it before, though it was the size of a large suitcase. Blade stood staring up at me with a smile as bright as the morning sun, and waved. "Come down." I was released from my place at the window, and I hurried to get dressed and run down to the lawn. In my haste, I forgot my shoes, but didn't notice until I felt the cold, wet grass beneath my feet. I stopped running and moved toward Blade slowly. He was still smiling, and he brushed his golden hair from his eyes, squinting in the bright sun. "I brought breakfast." Mouth-watering smells wafted out of the basket at his feet, and my stomach growled loudly. Blade suggested we have a picnic in the backyard and started around the corner of the house. I followed him, feeling a jittery mixture of excitement, nerves, and awe. The backyard was a labyrinth of bright flower beds, the colors tossed together haphazardly, as if the person who planted them had been either lazy or colorblind. I had spent much of my childhood playing amongst them, dancing with fairies and gnomes and anything else my imagination could conjure. I knew the flower garden and the nearby woods well, but I had never strayed far from the house. The flower beds sloped up from the northern wall and ended at the base of a small hill. Atop the hill sat the hedge maze. It loomed over me when I played in the yard, and I always had the uneasy feeling of being watched. I had entered the maze only once. It was not long after my parents' accident. I don't know what drew me to the maze. It terrified me even then, but I felt an irresistible urge to climb the hill and pass through the tall opening in the thick, tangled hedge. There was nothing frightening at first, just a long tunnel of gray-green leaves and branches woven tightly together. Then I came to a place where the path branched off in 2 different directions, and I took the one that veered to the left. The path started to descend, and the hedge walls towered above me. The light was dim, and the air was heavy. The path rose steeply behind me, and I decided to continue on, rather than try to turn back. There was a sudden dull thumping ahead of me. I froze and waited as it grew louder. Whatever was making the sound was getting closer. I started to cry. I was 6 at the time, and I suddenly realized at that moment that I was alone, and there was no one to protect me from whatever was coming. A shadow fell over me, and the thumping ceased. Slowly, I looked up. Towering high above me, almost as high as the hedge walls, was a giant man. He looked ill. His skin was pale and luminous. He had red stripes painted all over his arms and legs, and his eyes were black pools hidden deep in his red face. His hair was white, but tangled and matted with bright red blood. I screamed and started to run. The giant began screaming. His voice was high, and it screeched and echoed all around me. My little legs were moving faster than I thought possible. I felt like one of those cartoons where their feet turn into a spinning circle of dust. Fear moved me onward. But the giant didn't move. I turned a corner at the top of the hill, panting and with my heart pounding in my chest, and I saw him far below me, bellowing and shaking his fists at me. The ground beneath him was giving way, and he was slowly sinking out of sight. I turned and kept running. The path ended at another opening in the maze, and I felt the instant relief of no longer being contained in such a narrow space. There was a statue of a dog before me. It was large, far larger than any dog that exists today. The dog was alert, staring intently at another opening in the hedge, a path that led almost in the exact opposite direction from the giant. The dog's expression was tranquil, and I felt a little calmer. I laid my tiny hand on the dog's massive paw. The stone was warm beneath my fingers, and I turned to follow the path that the dog had indicated. I had not gone far when the calm feelings began to disappear. The path was rocky, and I tripped and fell down often. Once when I fell, I cut my chin, and it bled, leaving a small trail of red spots behind me. There was a cold wind blowing in my face, and I wrapped my arms tightly around my skinny torso. I was crying again, silently weeping in time with my slow steps. My tears were cold on my face, leaving icy trails down my cheeks that stung as they mixed with the blood on my chin. It was a dead end. The cold wind continued to blow all around me, and I collapsed, too exhausted and upset to go any further. I curled into a ball, trying to stay warm, and that is how Valencia found me. I don't know how she did it. She was old and hobbled when she walked already. She was going deaf and wouldn't have heard me even if I had called out for help. I didn't hear her approach. I looked and saw her slipper next to my head. I sat up slowly and took her outstretched hand. She pulled me close. Valencia was not normally a hugger, but she held me tightly for a long time before stepping back to examine me. Her face was stern, but her eyes were wet and filled with relief. It was then that she first told me about Raskies, evil spirits that played mischievous pranks and would steal your soul if you let them become attached to you. They were parasitic, with an unquenchable thirst, and would drain your body of life. She made me promise to never enter the maze with a Rasky. She said they would be instantly bound to me, and my soul would be in danger. Valencia was strangely serious and quiet. Even at 6, I was skeptical, but I also never entered the maze again and avoided climbing the hill behind the house. I turned my attention to the flower gardens, a maze of happy color in which there was no way I could become lost. I realized with horror that I had been standing with my eyes transfixed on the maze and not speaking. Blade was watching me quietly, with no trace of annoyance on his face. He smiled when I looked at him. "Are you back?" "Yeah, sorry." He shrugged and pushed his hair out of his eyes. "Whatever. You want to go up there?" "Oh, I don't know. We probably shouldn't." He sighed and looked up at the house. Valencia was in the window of the library, watching us with an expression that was hard to read. It seemed to be a mix of confusion, horror, and relief. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I was irritated that she was spying on us. I turned back to Blade. "Let's go." We ran up the hill, laughing and out of breath. Blade ran awkwardly under the weight of the picnic basket, but he still beat me to the top. I joined him at the entrance of the maze. He smiled at me and switched the basket to his other hand. "Ready?" I paused for a moment. A wave of nausea swept over me, and my heart was racing again. Blade reached over and took my hand, and a new fear came over me. His smile buoyed me through the opening in the maze, and we started down the path. It was dark, much darker than the last time I had been there. Branches intertwined overhead, forming a canopy of dusty leaves and cobwebs. An occasional shaft of sunlight broke through, but the light was mostly gray and dim. I clung to Blade's hand. He moved with confidence, as if he already knew where he was going and what would happen when he got there. I followed him for what felt like hours. My stomach was rumbling, and the smells from the basket seemed to grow stronger and more delicious as time went by. We passed through many intersections, with Blade choosing each path with the same casual confidence. Finally, we came to a large fountain. It was green and corroded and carved in the shape of a mighty roaring lion. Crystal clear water poured from its open jaws and bubbled into the basin below. All around the fountain, paths branched off in different directions. Blade placed the basket on the ground and dipped his hand into the water. He drank, dipped his hand again, and held it to my lips. I sipped tentatively from his palm, and the water was cool, clean, and delicious, with a slight hint of pine. He dropped my hand and drank from the fountain with both hands, kneeling at the edge, splashing water onto his face and arms. I knelt beside him and drank. The water was ice cold, and I plunged my head into the fountain. I opened my eyes, and the water looked dark and murky. It was deeper than it appeared, and I could see dark shapes swimming around in the depths. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the dark water. It burned horribly, but I swallowed again and again. I couldn't stop. Darkness closed in around me. Blade dragged me by my hair from the fountain, and I sputtered and choked as the black water poured from my mouth. He rubbed my back in smooth, soothing circles. When it was finally over, I lay in a patch of sun while he spread out a blanket and removed food from the basket. He lit candles and poured a light green liquid into 2 large wine glasses. It smelled like apples. I sat up. "What's that?" "A special wine my mom brews from apples," I like the color." He smiled and passed me a glass. I sipped cautiously. Valencia had allowed me a small glass of wine the previous Christmas, and I spent most of the night being sick and woke up with a screaming headache the next morning. The green wine was light and refreshing, with a taste like fresh-picked apples. I took a larger drink and felt it warm all the way down. Blade raised his glass, and I touched mine to his like I had seen people do in the movies. To us. We drank, and Blade leaned in to kiss me. My first kiss was everything I had hoped it would be. When we parted, he looked at me with a satisfied smile and began opening the different packages of food. I sipped more of my wine. My head felt light, and I laughed. Blade smiled back at me. I forgot about the fountain and the dark shapes and my involuntary attempt at drowning myself. As we sat in the sun, eating and talking, I felt happier than I had in my entire life. I felt normal. When the food and wine were gone, we lapsed into silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. We sat and listened to the sound of water splashing in the fountain. Blade reached over and took my hand. We sat like that for a long time. The sun rose high into the sky, and the temperature began to rise. My skin started to feel tight and hot, the beginnings of a painful sunburn. My head was clearer, and I started to notice the maze around us. There were 8 different exits from the open area around the fountain. They ran off in every direction, some filled with sun, some dark with gloom from the tangled branches that blocked all the light from the path. I had no idea which one led back to the house, and I felt the same tight panic I had felt 10 years before. Blade seemed to notice the change, and he stood up suddenly. "Let's go back. I need to watch my sister this afternoon." "Is it really that late?" He shrugged. His expression was distant, and his thoughts obviously focused somewhere else. I waited for him to move. I knew he would know the way back, but he just continued to stare. He seemed particularly interested in one of the entrances to the maze, the darkest path, the opening so overgrown that the entrance was no more than a small hole near the base of the hedge. Anyone who wanted to enter that path would have to crawl under the sharp branches and into the darkness. A small smile crept across Blade's face. It was more of a smirk, and it frightened me. I had blindly followed a boy I barely knew into the maze, and now relied on him to bring me home safely. Valencia flashed into my mind. Her face looking down on us from the library was more reserved and scared than I had ever seen her. Terror was just beginning to shimmy through my body, my hands just beginning to tremble, when Blade turned back to me with his usual wide smile. He scooped everything into the basket, without a care for spills or broken dishes. Grabbing my hand, he pulled me toward a sunny path almost opposite of the one on which he had been so transfixed. Valencia was still in the window when we returned. Blade looked for her as we exited the maze, as if he expected to see her standing where we had left her hours before. Her lips were in constant motion. The muttering had started a while ago, but it had been growing in intensity recently. Blade waved to Valencia and laughed, turning to me and flopping onto a nearby bench. "I heard the most fascinating story in town the other day." My heart sank. Blade didn't look at me. He pulled at a frayed hem on his jeans while he continued to speak. "The history of this house is pretty interesting. People get really excited talking about this place, like it's magic or something. I can see why they feel that way. There's something about the house and the land. Everything feels so powerful." He gave me a serious look that I had not seen before. There was something a little like fear in his eyes, a weakness that I had not expected. I was worried about where this conversation was going and waited impatiently for him to continue. Valencia's eyes burned into the back of my head, but I kept my back to her. "They say she's a witch. Your grandmother." "Great-grandmother." "Right. What's her name?" "Someone told me, but I can't remember now." I wondered who in town knew Valencia's name. She was never called anything but the old woman, a phrase that made children shiver and adults fall silent. "Valencia." It was then that she screamed, a high cracking sound that ripped through the calm afternoon and shattered the glass in front of her. She grabbed her hair and began to tear it from her head. The harsh scream continued without pause. I screamed at first, afraid that something was wrong with her, but Blade just stood watching her with an odd smile on his lips. Their eyes were locked, and they stood frozen that way, Valencia screaming and Blade smiling. My feet finally began to move, and I ran to the house. By the time I reached the library on the second floor, Valencia lay in a heap amongst the shards of glass. The silence after her screaming was electric. The tension in the air was tangible, like an overfilled balloon about to burst. I ran to her and found her pulse. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Blade helped me carry her to her room. I gently arranged her pillows and left her sleeping peacefully. The door shut softly behind me, and I burst into tears. Blade held me, and I cried until there were no more tears left to shed. He just stood there, holding me patiently until my fear and emotion had been vented onto the front of his blue t-shirt. I left a wet patch on the left-hand side, right over his heart. My hair was plastered to my cheek. He tucked it behind my ear and wiped away the tears that remained. I have to go. It's almost 4. Valencia came to my room that evening. She was withered and small, though once she had been an unstoppable force. I was reading. Well, I had a book open on my lap, but in reality I had been reliving every moment of my picnic with Blade. She came and sat on the edge of my bed. Her face was pale and haggard, more witch-like than ever. It made me think of Blade's parting words that afternoon. I was nervous as I walked him to the door and waited to see if he would kiss me again. He seemed thoughtful when he turned to me on the steps. I stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame and trying to look alluring. He gave me one of his most mischievous smiles. I think it's cool that she's a witch. He didn't say anything else but jumped off the steps and started down the drive. He didn't turn to look back at me. His confidence was too great for that. He knew my eyes were glued to him, memorizing his every move until he rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. I have to admit that I remained in the doorway even after he was gone, replaying his walk in my mind. There was something distinct about it. He moved in slow motion, a careless stride that drew the eye and held it. There was something mysterious and dangerous about him, a definite contrast to his healthy good looks. I wanted to keep thinking about Blade, but Valencia was still sitting on my bed, looking at me in a way that made me suspicious and fearful. In her hands, she held a gruesome wooden doll. The lower part was a normal doll, a smiling child with a disconnected look on their carefully crafted face. But a second head perched atop the first, and its face was twisted and fearsome. The eyes bulged forth in rage, and the mouth spewed fire. Snakes rose from the head in a writhing halo, and their hands gripped the lower face, digging their bony fingers into the flesh. This is a Rasky doll. I got it many, many years ago when I traveled into the jungles in the far south. The natives there believe in evil spirits called the Raskies. You've told me about them before. I did? Oh, yes, I remember. Her eyes drifted to the window. She fell silent and seemed lost in thought. Suddenly she blinked rapidly and shook her head. There is more to be said, much more. Raskies are a torn spirit, 2 halves of a once mighty soul, ripped apart by sorcery. The soul splits in different ways. No 2 are alike. Many end up with one side that is almost entirely good, and the other mostly evil. The evil side is usually the strongest, and is in control of both sides most of the time. She paused and nervously caressed the doll's blank face. Her hands were shaking. When she looked at me, her eyes were red and wet. There is one that the natives spoke of by name, Gretek, master of the Raskies, the spirit of a once mighty and terrible god. He was in love with a young witch not long after the beginning of time, but she was too free a spirit to give her love to one man, even if he was a god. Her constant rejections enraged him, and he lost his reason. He went to battle her on her hallowed lands, misjudging the strength of her magic. The battle lasted 14 days and burned down the trees and grass and anything else that surrounded them. She called forth her final attack, drawing to her the very last of her powers, and she split him, turning him from a mighty god to a mere Rasky, the ultimate humiliation. He swore revenge on her and has spent many years planning his attack. He returns to this world once every generation, and I believe he will return this year. I have waited for the signs." She stopped and began to cough. Her breath rattled in her chest, and she looked so weak that I reached out and touched her arm. She gave me a small smile and covered my hand with hers. "You're a good girl, Casey. Your parents would have been very proud of the young woman you have become. Please do not let anyone turn you away from your path. Your life is far too important." "Okay, Valencia, I won't." I had no idea what she was talking about. She sighed. "Can you tell me more about your friend? The one who lives at the end of the drive. Does he have any siblings? What are his parents like?" Valencia had opened the floodgates. I prattled on about Blade for over half an hour until I noticed her fingers. She was clutching the Rasky doll so tightly that they were completely white and bloodless. Thin strands of smoke rose up from between them. I blinked, and the smoke disappeared. Her grip loosened, and she attempted to smile and look natural. "Go on, dear. Your friend sounds very interesting. You seem to like him a lot." "I do. I feel so weird around him." "You are in love, my dear. Pure and simple. Though real love is neither." "What was in the basket?" I smiled foolishly. I had hoped to have my first girl talk with a group of giggling girlfriends, but if it had to be with Valencia, I was just happy to have it. I told her about our picnic, omitting the pale green wine and grazing over the kiss. She raised her eyebrows, but said nothing. A small smile was on her lips, but it faded quickly. "What did he do before he ate? Did he say anything, like a prayer or something?" "No. We washed our hands in the fountain, but he didn't say anything." Her face relaxed, and she laughed. "It's getting late. You'd better get to bed if you're going to be awake when your friend arrives tomorrow. He seems to be an early riser." Then she tucked me in like she had when I was little and smoothed my hair back on the pillow. She gave me a gentle smile and grazed my forehead with her dry lips. "Sleep well, my dear. Dream of your handsome young man." She stopped in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from the hall, but she didn't speak, and she closed the door softly behind her a moment later. I lay awake for a long time, thinking mostly about Blade and our kiss, but thoughts of Valencia and her wild screaming kept interfering. Something was wrong with her, and I was scared to acknowledge it. I worried what would happen if she went away. I was too young to live on my own and had no other living relatives. Sleep did come eventually, and I was tormented by strange dreams where the Rasky doll danced and twirled as it chased me into a lake of fire. I woke several times, soaked with sweat and with my heart racing. Each time I drifted off, I returned to the lake, and finally, I had to force myself to stay awake until dawn. I rose with the first light and went to my window. Blade smiled up at me from the wet grass, his feet shrouded in the last of the early morning mist. Chapter 3. Every morning at dawn, Blade stood below my window. We spent most of our days together. He joined me on my treks into town and carried my bags on the way home. The kids lounging in front of the grocery store, melting in the summer's oppressive heat, took notice of me for the first time since childhood. The girls looked hungrily at Blade as we passed, shooting me looks of disbelief mixed with anger. The rumors started after our first trip into town. The kids were saying that Valencia had helped me put a love spell on Blade. They could find no other explanation for his interest in me. Honestly, I was just as confused as they were. Blade was sweet and affectionate toward me, but we hadn't kissed since our picnic in the maze. However, he professed his feelings for me in other ways, squeezing my hand or reciting sonnets to me while he lounged on a low, curved branch of a large oak tree in our front yard. He was classically romantic, and I felt like I was living in one of the great love stories. He was Romeo to my Juliet, Heathcliff to my Catherine. My heart and head were full of him. The rumor about the love spell bothered me because I had actually been doing some reading on the subject. My evenings were long and boring, and on one particularly dull night, I wandered into Valencia's library. I dawdled around, taking in the different knickknacks that littered the shelves and held most of the books hostage, trapped in gathering dust. There was one section of the library that was free of clutter, where the books were organized and clean. I squeezed behind her desk, between the stacks of books and papers, and pulled a large green volume from the tidy shelves. The gold letters on the spine proclaimed the book to be filled with charms, spells, and enchantments. I opened to a random page. They smelled old and dusty, and the paper crackled as the book fell open. It was a love spell. Below the recipe was a drawing of a man and a woman embracing and staring into each other's eyes as the world burned, unnoticed, around them. The man was facing out and looked surprisingly like an older version of Blade. The woman in his arms was slight. Her hair was darker and longer than mine, but our features were vaguely similar. The book was filled with love spells. There were other ones for wealth or power. There were even a few darker spells dealing with death and the dead. But love spells dominated the book. There were different ones for different levels of infatuation. Some of the more specific spells made me blush. It was hard to describe what I felt when I thought about them. I was confused and a little excited, but I was also a little bit repulsed. The idea of turning Blade's heart into a ball of mush was appealing to me. He made me nervous when I was near him. Even after all the time we spent together, I still could not look him in the eye. The desire to have power over him, to bend him to my will, was strong. Stronger still was the overwhelming fear that I was dreaming. I would wake up one day and he would not be outside my window. He was a fantasy, so ideal that he couldn't really exist. And yet he was still there every morning, smiling that smile that melted my heart. The rest of the books behind Valencia's desk had covers full of mystical words and fanciful images. I chose a book from the highest shelf. It had a soft black cover with the name Giovanni embossed across it in silver. As I sat and stared at it, the letters blurred and took on different shapes. A boat sailed off the page and rode a stormy sea. I could hear the thunder and feel the cold, salty spray on my face. As I watched, the boat sank and took the shape of a mountainous coastline. A body lay on the thin beach, face down, but breathing. Valencia called to me from the kitchen and the pictures faded away. The words in the book were again clear, telling the story of an apprentice witch. I closed the book, took a deep breath, and opened it again. It opened to the same page. The same story. Valencia called to me again and I quickly replaced the book. Though she had never told me not to touch her books, I felt guilty and nervous as I went to find her. It soon became my nightly ritual. I crept into the library every evening after dinner, when Valencia was curled up in bed with a glass of warm milk and her television. I started with the story of the witch's apprentice, and slowly worked my way through the books behind her desk. The books began to lead my studies by falling off the shelves or always opening to the same page. I read what they offered, and I began to learn about the witches of Norg Hollow. Norg Hollow was a hidden land far in the south, a tiny island off the coast of Antarctica. The witches were there at the beginning of the world. They thrived for millions of years, connected to our world only through a magic lake that showed them whatever they wished to see. When human beings came along, the witches were intrigued. Humans closely resembled the witches in appearance and communication, but most lacked the ability to create or control magic. As they watched the men and women struggling to survive century after century, many witches grew sympathetic toward them and wished to leave Norg Hollow and help them. The high priestess, Meneme, was among the sympathizers and allowed the witches to cross the seas. They dispersed all over this new world, and at first their help was gratefully accepted. As humans grew more prosperous and confident, they began to desire more power. They created new idols of worship and cast the witches down, cursing them and running them out of society. There was a long, dark period in the history of the witches of Norg Hollow. The pictures and tales from that time haunted my dreams. The remaining witches went into hiding for many years, but eventually, a movement surfaced, calling for all remaining witches to travel back to Norg Hollow, a place they had been unable to find when the dark times came. The journey had been attempted many times, and the witches that departed for the home of their ancestors were never seen again. I began to study the books in Valencia's library. I learned spells and myths and charms and potions. As I began to understand the witches of Norg Hollow, I began to understand Valencia, and in some ways, I began to better understand myself. The witches were odd, compared to humans, and they thrived in solitude. I felt as if I understood them better than I understood my supposed peers. My days fell into a pattern, mornings with Blade and evenings with the witches. I felt like I was learning more than I had in my entire 16 years of life. I didn't tell Blade about my studies. It seemed like an odd interest, and though he had accepted Valencia as a witch, I could not expect him to accept it in me. I was struggling enough with the roller coaster of emotions I endured in my every waking moment. Love was as painful as it was pleasurable. It was a surprising feeling, though not altogether enjoyable. Blade remained a mystery. He went from attentive and affectionate to distant and sharp in a matter of seconds. The latter would bring out a nasty side of him, a cold response with a hint of something much worse lurking just beneath the surface. It scared me, but his moodiness was usually quick and over in a matter of minutes. He was always apologetic when it was over. He knew it scared me and was quick to make amends. I willingly accepted his apology every time, and we would return to being happy for a while. A rough patch. That was what Valencia would have called it. That's what she called it when the whole town was gossiping about the bank teller's cheating husband. I came home from school excited to tell Valencia the latest playground gossip. Her face tightened, accentuating every wrinkle, and she told me that the bank teller and her husband were having a rough patch, and it was none of my business. That's how I thought of my relationship with Blade. These moments of anger were mere bumps in our path, something to overcome and forget as soon as they were over. Most of the time, he was incredibly sweet. We spent the mornings exploring the many paths that ran through the woods around the house. There was a well-kept trail running through the eastern woods, which led to Blade's house, and branching off of it, there were dozens of smaller trails. They all led to some amazing display of nature, and each one seemed to be more awe-inspiring than the last. My favorite was a clearing surrounded by younger trees, their slim trunks bathed in the golden light of early morning. Leaves littered the ground, and there was nothing else, just an opening in the trees. The trail leading there was lined with oaks, crowding each other and looming far overhead. The sun slipped in between the leaves and speckled the ground with light. The energy in the clearing was strong. There was a pulse of life there, a power just barely contained. Blade didn't see the appeal. He didn't feel anything standing in the middle of the clearing. We left it quickly, but I marked the entrance as we rejoined the main path by dropping my necklace at the base of a tree, so it was barely visible unless you were looking for it. I went back there often by myself. The evenings were long, boring affairs unless I had something to occupy my mind, and I couldn't spend as much time in the library. Valencia kept her books in meticulous order, and I accidentally misplaced one. She began shutting herself in the library after dinner and not leaving until I had gone to bed. Some nights I think she slept in there. The sound of her muttering, muted by the thick library door, was a constant drone in the night, and I enjoyed visiting the clearing to escape it. I went there almost every evening. I liked to sit in the very center of the clearing, close my eyes, and just listen. The forest was alive with sound, but in the clearing all of the sounds were dull, softened so as not to offend the tranquility of the space. The light was honey-colored and cast everything in a golden hue. The forest behind the first ring of trees was hidden in shadow, giving the clearing a safe, protected feeling. The air vibrated with energy, and when I left, I felt rejuvenated. Not all of the paths ended in places as nice as my golden haven. Some led to creepy places in the darker parts of the forest. Blade's favorite was a large cave, cut deep into the mountainside on the northern edge of the forest. The opening to the cave was wide and filled with a deep darkness, the kind of dark that seemed to have a shape of its own. The rocks above were craggy and jutted off the side of the mountain, giving the impression of a massive face, with the cave as its yawning mouth. Blade always wanted to go in, but I refused. He would smile, duck inside, and be instantly lost in the darkness within. I screamed the first time he did it. There was something about the cave that terrified me. I would wait nervously for his return, and he was never consistent. Most visits were brief, but on other days he would be gone for over an hour. The first time we went there, he was gone for most of the morning. I cried while I waited, and convinced that he had been hurt or killed, I tried to will myself to go in after him. It was always cold near the cave. A constant biting wind flowed from the opening, and I would sit hunched and shivering until Blade returned. It drained me to sit there. Dark, gruesome thoughts filled my head until I wanted to scream and run off into the woods. It seemed to have the opposite effect on Blade. The cave energized him, and he always emerged from its icy darkness smiling and rejuvenated. We began spending every morning there. Blade stopped coming to my window, and I would wake with the sun and meet him where the path to the cave joined the main trail. As much as I hated the energy of the place and dreaded the darkness of my own thoughts, I could not be away from Blade. There were a few bad days when he seemed angry and lost, but most mornings he was happy and paid me a lot of attention. I liked kissing him. He spoke beautiful words to me, and my heart would pound wildly at the sound of his melodic voice. The words usually didn't make sense, but the inflection he gave them was thrilling. They had a shape and a texture, and I felt dull and senseless when he spoke, unable to think of anything but his voice. Some days he would read to me from an old book bound in worn red leather. The words were in Italian, a language I loved to listen to but did not understand. Blade spoke it fluently. I would sit for hours listening to him. His voice was low, almost slipping into a chant at times. The energy surrounding the cave changed when he read to me. The cold winds faded to a cool, gentle breeze, and the light grew warmer and brighter. One morning, Blade abruptly stopped reading and looked at me with an expression far more serious than any I'd seen before. "I have to go." "What do you mean? Where are you going?" He didn't answer, but stood and closed the book after carefully marking our place with a thin white ribbon. He stared off into the woods and seemed lost in thought, as if he was looking at something amongst the trees that only he could see. "Blade, I have to go. I'll see you tomorrow." His voice sounded strange, far away and quiet. He walked away and left me alone beside the cave. The wind grew stronger and became even colder. It howled and rushed from the darkness and swirled around me, whipping my hair into my eyes. I couldn't move. My feet were heavy and I stood there, convulsing in the frigid air and crying. I slowly stepped toward the cave, and the wind calmed a little. I moved closer. The wind grew less. I stood at the entrance of the cave and peered into the blackness. There was a small pinpoint of light deep inside. It flickered and danced, and I could not look away. I barely noticed as I began to inch my way into the gloom. Suddenly, I heard Valencia's voice. It drifted up the path on a warm breeze and cut through the cold darkness. The light vanished. I left the cave and started back toward the main path. Still, the light intrigued me. I wanted to get closer. I wanted to see what it was that made Blade so happy. I was irritated as I walked back toward the house. Valencia's voice made the light go out, and I was immediately and wildly angry. She stood near the house and watched me approach with a worried expression. She looked like she was about to speak, so I stopped and stood sullenly in front of her. She hugged me close and held me tight in a surprisingly strong embrace. I returned the hug stiffly. Valencia held me out at arm's length and looked at me. After a moment, she smiled and shuffled back into the house. I followed a moment later, with my thoughts once again consumed by the light in the cave.